Hey, everybody. Welcome to Autism Confidential, the podcast from NCSA. I'm Jill Escher. I am your host today. I'm the president of NCSA, and I'm very, very pleased to be bringing you an episode all about one of the most controversial but most important issues in all of autism, which is autism's prevalence, which is the degree, the rate at which autism actually occurs in the population. Now, we have two wonderful guests today. Very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Walter Zaharodny. Dr. Zaharodny is director of the New Jersey Autism Study. It is the monitoring site for, I'm sure you've all heard of the CDC study. The CDC every couple of years comes out with new autism prevalence numbers. So he's in charge of the New Jersey investigations, and he is also associate professor of pediatrics at Rutgers University and New Jersey Medical School. Sorry, and also with us today is Josephine Shinuda, who was co-investigator of that CDC project. You'll heard it referred to as the ADDM project, the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network project. She's also the project manager of that work in New Jersey. So welcome to both of you. Very pleased to have you. Let's start off with you, Dr. Zaharodny. You've been doing autism monitoring as an epidemiologist for some time. Can you just give people some background to the work you have done?
Yeah, so I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. In 1999, 2000, the CDC was involved in a community investigation of autism prevalence in Brick Township, New Jersey. And they found a higher than expected rate of autism, 6.7 per thousand. And that was striking because it was a lot higher than what was expected. I think expected was 2 cases per thousand. Anyway, that was very notable, but the CDC didn't have the ability to determine whether that was based on some unusual cluster of autism in that town, or whether that was consistent with how frequently autism was occurring in New Jersey. So we were encouraged to apply for the first wave of support to do autism surveillance in cooperation with the CDC. They had decided to establish an autism and developmental monitoring network in multiple US states. And that system was to use a very thorough, active, multiple source process for finding all true cases of autism in young children in our region. And so we wanted to understand why the number of children with autism was presenting in our centers, in our clinics in New Jersey at ever greater numbers. Nobody in our group really had experience doing autism surveillance or public health monitoring. And in fact, it turns out that no one in the state had ever tried to put both health and education information together to try to understand any childhood disability or problem. And so out of naivete, we plunged in and had a lot of early luck in that people in the Department of Education, the Commissioner of Education, and other leaders understood what we wanted to do and decided to help us. And that was also true for our major health centers. And so we started doing what the CDC had proposed. It was frankly a lot more difficult than I had expected because not having a real history of epidemiologic research, I thought all we would need to do is identify the children who had an autism diagnosis. And how hard could that be, even if you tried to do it in a large region? And well, once you do that once or twice, what else would there be to learn? Because no one would suspect that the rate of autism or the characteristics of autism would change over time. So we did it as part of a 6-element ADAM network in 2000. And we repeated the process again in our region for the next study year, which was 2002. And the thing to remember is we weren't focusing on all children at all age, in all age ranges. We were focused on specific cohorts of children when they were 8 years old. By 8, it was thought that the vast majority of children with autism would have been evaluated by the public education system and by the clinical resources and practitioners in the region. And we couldn't cover the whole state because this was a very labor-intensive methodology, which required us to go through all the available health and education records for that cohort of 8-year-olds. So we picked a region. It was a 4-county region in New Jersey. Other states chose their surveillance areas. The CDC stipulated that the region we selected had to have a birth population of at least 25,000 children per year. And if possible, that it should be a geographically contiguous area, like continuous with not big gaps anywhere, so that we could have confidence that we were not missing any specific or important regions in doing surveillance. And so we picked out a 3-county region, Essex, Hudson, and Union County in New Jersey. The New Jersey Medical School is in Essex County. Essex County, Union County, and Hudson County are all adjacent to each other, and they're very consistent with the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area in terms of dense population and very diverse, both racially, ethnically, and an economically diverse region. And we did want to understand what had happened in Brick Township, so we also elected to include Ocean County, which is the county in which Brick Township was one of the larger towns. And we were gratified in 2002 to find that our prevalence estimate was very much similar to what we identified in 2000. In New Jersey, we found a rate of 9.9 per thousand in 2000 and 10.6 per thousand in the 2002 cycle. Those are very close, suggesting to me that the methodology was reliable and stable. And since our base population was stable, not changing dramatically, the methodology was able to generate consistent and reliable estimates. And that was great. We already learned within those first 2 cycles that autism was much more prevalent than even in Brick Township overall, and that the methodology was very productive because not only could we use it to generate accurate prevalence estimates, but we could use it to do very careful, detailed case level description of the cases. Autism is, in addition to being prevalent, is very heterogeneous in expression. And so by taking careful stock of the complete, that is the universal range of children in our area, we could not only figure autism prevalence, but describe how many children had other associated features, other diagnoses, or other health problems.
So you've been doing the autism surveys in New Jersey for, let me do the math, more than 20 years.
Yeah, it's getting close to 20 years. That's right. What we were doing was unprecedented. We established the system and kept using it. And it was a unique system. I thought, to the credit of the CDC, they developed a methodology and promoted a methodology that used a consistent autism diagnosis that was anchored to the DSM definition of autism. And we had very strict reliability procedures by which we reviewed, then scored and analyzed the data so as to be accurate and consistent over time.
Now,
the definition of autism didn't change in that period, whether we were looking in 2000, 2002, or in later periods. Everyone was using the DSM-4 autism diagnostic criteria. And The
And I
other
just
thing,
want to interject that, in California, along a similar vein, the state started noticing a significant uptick in autism cases in the developmental services system in, kind of the early 90s, which I think was a little bit even before the Brick Township question, right, came up in New Jersey. And again, in California, using consistent criteria, which were the entry criteria for developmental services, which were pretty strict criteria. This wasn't just anybody with autism. You had to also have, a significant developmental disability, involved with this autism. They saw a very rapid rise in cases that really began, in the mid to late 80s and then into the 90s. When they had about 3,000 cases throughout the state in the early-ish 80s. When it hit 16,000 cases, they were freaking out in California. They said, how could this be, right? Autism is so rare. We've never, it was just a tiny, tiny part of the developmental services system. And they started commissioning reports in the state to try to figure out, like, what is going on here? Is this real? And they found that it wasn't due to expanding diagnostic factors. They couldn't tell what was causing it, but they said that the cause was real. That was when there were 16,000 cases. Now there are 150,000 cases, right? About 10 times as many cases, right? And people have kind of thrown up their hands. I'm sorry to go on that little tangent, but just to say, on the other side of the country, there was a similar phenomenon. That's all.
Right. No, you're exactly right. The phenomenon of rising autism prevalence was definitely identified first from the DDS data in California. It took us, that is the ADAM network, a couple of years of repeat surveillance to establish like a trend sequence. So it wasn't really until maybe 2007 or later when we were doing maybe our third cohort that we clearly saw that the prevalence was increasing significantly. Had we been interested in tracking the federal IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Act, which has authority over special education records, we would have also, however, seen a significant parallel rise in number of children classified with autism for special education services. And had we chosen to look at Medicaid database studies looking at children with autism served by Medicaid, that also showed a parallel increase. And I'm certain that pretty much any indicator that was tracking autism prevalence or frequency of autism was registering the same phenomenon. I have yet to find a significant either administrative or epidemiologic sequence which suggests that autism at some point plateaued or decreased.
Yeah, certainly based on the California data, we have not yet seen a plateau. There was a report published last year, I could link to it in the show notes, that showed that cases were increasing pretty consistently about 11% a year in the DDS. And that the prevalence is not just the caseload, but the prevalence was increasing. It was, and again, no sign of plateauing at all. And we saw also some very consistent things, such as the male to female prevalence. Again, around 4 to 1, right. Male to female over time. We didn't see that change, although a little bit more female prevalence in recent years. Anyway, I do want to return to you, but just to say that I agree with you. I've read, I don't know, countless, studies on autism prevalence, and they're very consistent in the U.S. and in Western countries. The same trajectory. I've read studies from Canada. I've read studies from the United Kingdom, right. From Denmark, from Sweden, from not much in Asia. There's some from Japan, a little bit from Korea. Korea's pretty famous. South Korea is pretty famous for their studies. Same trajectory. We see the same pattern. Now, can we just put a little bit of data here, if you don't mind throwing us some numbers, please, Josephine, chime in. You guys know New Jersey better than anyone. Let's start with New Jersey, then let's go to national. Tell us, we just heard about these kind of 1% figures that you guys found, almost 20 years ago. What's happened in the last 20 years?
Well, contrary to at least my expectation, autism increased significantly over the period since 2002. I was frankly expecting autism prevalence to keep registering at the 1% level in New Jersey, because I think we had a very solid, diverse, populous region. We had a region that was served by high quality public education and a sufficient number of experts. And why should prevalence of autism increase? I certainly wasn't aware of any increases in similar disabilities like intellectual disability or cerebral palsy. In fact, cerebral palsy may be declining. So the idea that autism would increase was, I guess, counterintuitive and unexpected, but it did increase, and it increased across all groups that we were looking at. Increased for boys and girls, Black children, white children, Hispanic, Asian children, increased by different types of autism. Children with autism plus intellectual disability increased, and autism in children with borderline or average intellectual ability increased also. And so it was not a pattern that made me suspect that what we were seeing was just an improvement or a fine-tuning of either our surveillance capacity or just an indicator of better awareness. The increase from 2002 to 2006 was greater, was really in the magnitude of 0.5%. So to see a change that rapid, given no change in the methodology, the region, the acuity of the procedures or anything, that would not be the magnitude of an increase one would expect just by better awareness of autism.
Well, let's jump forward to your recent studies, because your recent studies did not find 1%. Right, in New Jersey. Josephine, can you tell us a little bit about those papers, which were jaw-dropping?
Right, so we wanted to look at variation at the county level and the school district level. So we knew that global variation was really due to methodology, was due to maybe different ages that are surveyed and different case definitions. So like Walter was saying, we have autism around 2% in the US, it's higher in Iceland, it's higher in Australia, but it's around 1% in Denmark, Sweden, but it's low in France and Germany, it's less than 1%. So we know that the global variation are probably due to different methodologies. In the US, when we look at ADAM, we're using the same methodology, we're using the same case definition, yet we're still seeing variability between states. New Jersey is around 3%. When we go to Wisconsin, Missouri, it's around 1 and 1.5%. So we wanted to look locally at New Jersey to see if the variation still exists at the county level and the school district level. And what we found was there's still a lot of variations. We found that Ocean County was around 5.5%. And we found a lot of school districts like—
So it went from, in Ocean County, it went from about 1% to more than 5%.
Yes.
In about 20 years.
Yeah, and if you think of Brick Township as being representative and correct, which I do, their rate was 0.6 per thousand or 0.6%. So to go from that to 5% overall for the whole region is really like a blunt change, not a subtle change.
Not subtle, not subtle.
Not only that, some districts were over 7%. In some school districts, large school districts, not small. Yeah.
I read those papers. I wrote about those papers. I'll put maybe a link in the show notes to those blog posts and also to the papers. But it was amazing. Those papers came out and you were saying, 5%, 7% of children in these metropolitan areas of New Jersey having autism. And I think everybody shrugged their shoulders and said, oh, well, we just must be noticing it better. Good for us. We're diagnosing better. We're diagnosing extremely mild cases that would never have been noticed before. There isn't any actual biological phenomenon here underlying this, right? That seemed to be the response. Obviously, that's not my response. I'm firmly convinced there has been, in fact, a dramatic increase in autism, not just in New Jersey, but across the country. The evidence is overwhelming. Why did that happen? Can you tell me a little bit about the underlying nature of these diagnoses? And can you convince me that they would not have been overlooked before? Or maybe these people just would have been called geeks. Maybe these people would have been called, kind of antisocial in some fashion, right?
Yeah, so from the beginning and consistently throughout our activities, I've always understood that we are looking at autism spectrum disorder, a neurodevelopmental disability, not a trait, not a preference, or something more akin to a disorder, because it's defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, indeed, as being a disorder. And disorder means, in addition to the expected constellation of symptoms or features, that the individual's overall functioning, life functioning in practical circumstances is impaired or disabled. That is, that they have some significant deficit in being able to do expected things for their age. We never entered into the process or the program of finding individuals with autistic features or autistic signs or autistic personality characteristics or related problems. There are other both disorders and other impairments described in the DSM, which have elements of similarity to autism, but are not autism. We were never expecting to identify children who had some atypical social preference or difficulty in play. These were always, in my mind, children who would be easily recognized by experts, both in education and in health, and be recognized by their parents as having a disability or disorder.
So 5 to 7%, right?
Right.
Now, and these were 8-year-olds, right?
Correct, yes.
Children in New Jersey. And
Right.
you were telling me these are people with measurable disability, measurable impairments, inability to carry on things that would be expected of a child that age, and not personality traits, not quirkiness,
right?
A disorder under the DSM.
Yes, a
Right.
clear disorder linked to all the descriptive criteria enumerated by the DSM. At first DSM-4, but later DSM-5. Mm-hmm. We know that autism doesn't have any biomarkers, but by maintaining a very principled and consistent definition, and by reviewing a huge amount of information in professional evaluations, it's not like we're pulling out just that somebody diagnosed Johnny with autism. We're pulling out all the detailed, specific characteristics which define as have somebody with autism, and experts are using all of that information to determine with reliability which children have autism spectrum disorder. It's not just that we're identifying kids who are diagnosed or classified. And that's the advantage, I would say, of the active case finding strategy. When we did our first surveillance of surveillance of autism, I frankly didn't understand to what extent there would be any children with autism who didn't yet have an autism diagnosis at age 8. I was a pretty well-experienced clinician at that time and had a wide range of pediatric experience and diagnostic background. And I frankly didn't expect to find more than a couple of extra cases. That is, children who have the characteristics of autism but haven't been diagnosed. When we did our first cycle, second cycle, every cycle since then, we find about 20% extra. That is 20% children with autism who haven't yet been diagnosed.
Mainly verbal children, mainly kind of in the normalish IQ range?
I would say yes, for the most part, these would be children who have less than severe levels of impairment and are less likely to have intellectual disability. These children may have ability to avoid detection before the age of 36 months, and even getting into the school system. It may be a while before the special education system identifies that they have some learning or behavioral issues and then does that comprehensive evaluation. It's from those comprehensive evaluations that we see that there's always 1 in 5 extra children beyond those who have the diagnosis from a doctor in their community.
Right.
So I guess that was one of the first surprises from our activities. We had lots of interesting discoveries that occurred rather early as well. When we started doing surveillance, it was expected that perhaps as many as 70% of all the autism cases would also have intellectual disability, because that's what earlier generations of epidemiologic studies from Europe and the United States suggested. But it's not so. We've always found that autism is represented across the intellectual range. There are somewhere between 30 and 40% of children with autism who are intellectually disabled as well. But the rest of the children have widely disparate and sometimes confounding problems in the range of intellectual abilities or in pockets of performance. So, and regardless of whether we're talking only about autism diagnosed or the complete number of children who have been identified with autism, these are children who are in about 85 to 90% of the individuals we find receiving special education services. These are not children who are have articulation problems or small problems that can be addressed through some subtle exchange or didactic process. A lot of these children also have, as we found and as we parsed the data, more than expected proportion of children with ADHD. Even though ADHD and autism couldn't be diagnosed simultaneously under the rules of DSM-4, ultimately we found that close to 40% of all the kids with autism had diagnosis of ADHD, not just features or signs or lack of attention, had been diagnosed with the syndrome of ADHD. So these children were more prevalent than we expected. The prevalence unexpectedly increased over time. The increase affected a wide range of children across all groups that we could look at. And the children we were looking at were disabled or had a true neurodevelopmental disorder, not just atypical children.
Let me ask 2 follow-up questions to that. The first is comparing apples to apples. Let's just talk about cases of autism with intellectual disability. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that maybe what you found in that 0.6% in Brick Township were cases with ID. I'm guessing. I don't know if that's true or not. But can you give an example of like that early, cohort of children and a more recent cohort of children with ID? Can you compare those? Because then you are comparing at least apples to apples. These are cases that wouldn't have gone undetected.
Yeah. Right? Josephine may have additional ways of commenting on this, but the way I look at it and the way I compare over time is that whether you're talking about the first cycle of surveillance that we completed in the 4-county region, or whether you're looking as far back as Brick Township, and whether you're looking into the most recent cycle of prevalence investigation or not. These cases have been increasing, and in spite of our holding every aspect of our methodology and our procedures consistent, the number and the proportion of cases has increased. And increased in a way that gives me at least confidence that these are increases not only in the absolute number of ASD children, but that the majority of these individuals would have what I would call satisfied the conditions of autistic disorder. Mm-hmm. In the DSM-4 era, you recall, of course, that there were discrete autism conditions: autistic disorder, PDD, NOS, Asperger's disorder. The number and the pattern of symptoms required for autistic disorder is the most complete and encompassing and signifies the most traditional level of impairment. It's always been above 80%. The Brick Township found that more than 80% of all their identified cases satisfied the autistic disorder condition. And we've been finding very much the same pattern when we looked across the many cycles. It isn't really that we've picked up disproportionately more PDD and OS cases or more Asperger's cases than we did early in our activities. The overwhelming majority of children we've picked up, regardless of what their cohort was, in my opinion, satisfied what we would consider the autistic disorder type. And that certainly involves significant lasting impairment across many domains.
Yes. Every case I've met with autistic disorder, including my own 2 kids who were diagnosed under DSM-4 with autistic disorder and who are nonverbal, have enduring and very severe functional impairment. The vast majority of these cases, won't work. They won't live independently, and continue to have, some level of behavioral and support needs across their lives. No question about it. Let me ask you one other follow-up question to this. When I talk about the New Jersey numbers, I often get this retort: well, everyone moves to New Jersey for the services, right? They hear about the public schools, they move to New Jersey, it's all immigration. Guys, what do you say to that?
Well, most of the cases that we identify with autism through the surveillance, about 80 to 85%, are born in New Jersey. At the end of the study year or the study cycle of surveillance, we link all of the autism cases to their birth certificate, and about 80 to 85% of them match. Since autism is diagnosed around age 3 to 5, most of families would be moving in after the child is age 3 to 5. So the fact that we're seeing 80 to 85% of the cases born in New Jersey tells us that it's not really an in-migration issue.
I do believe parents would migrate, would move in order to enhance their child's educational advantages or to get better resources. But in the real 21st century world, New Jersey's part of the New York metropolitan area, and one of the most expensive places in the country to live. And just the number of people moving to New Jersey is far below what other states in the network are used to. In states like Georgia, South Carolina, Utah, Arizona, they have a much higher rate of in-migration than we do and lower rates of autism.
Yeah, our denominator has been stable since 2000. So it's always been a 30,000 birth cohort. And in 2016, in our recent cycle, it was around 30,000 8-year-olds in the study region. So it really hasn't changed that much over time too.
There is some migration. You know, we're living in a world where people can do that and sometimes do that, but it's not as frequent and certainly not a reason for why New Jersey's rate is increased, or why it's also not a good reason for why autism rates are higher than in those other ATOM network states. The ATOM network states are for the most part, are underestimating autism prevalence. It's not so much that we're overestimating, but they're to varying degrees dramatically or somewhat underestimating. Sometimes that's because their investigators don't have complete access to both education and health records. That will decrease the success of their case finding and will reduce their autism estimate. But also, it also reflects the fact that across the United States, the available resources and utilization of resources can be dramatically different. The children in Utah have a different pattern of seeking services than children in New Jersey. And in general, states with better resources, clinical resources, also spend more money on educational programs. And therefore, they create the information data, the data sets that allow us to identify true cases. As Josephine mentioned, some states don't have access to education records. Why they're in the network and compared to states that do have, I don't really understand. And over time, the interesting phenomenon has been, I think, to a purposeful shifting away from highlighting individual states' prevalence to emphasizing the network average or the network overall estimate. Mm-hmm. If you put states with low prevalence.
By the way, I'll interject. I think you're talking about like 1 in 88, 1 in 68, 1 in 54, 1 in 42, you know.
Right.
That you're talking about the national, that gets a lot of attention, right?
It gets a lot of attention, mm-hmm. which is good, but it is that national figure, that composite for the ATOM network, which I think most recently went from 1 in 54 to 1 in 43 or 44. Mm-hmm. That is still an underestimate, I would say almost a purposeful underestimate of autism across the United States, because it puts together states with low prevalence estimates due to low case finding and states with good case finding. So for my money, people should be aware of what the overall ATOM estimate is, but then look to states with high estimates, because they're the ones that are likely more complete in case finding and more accurate in their estimates. For the longest period of time, New Jersey was clearly the leading indicator compared to other states. Our estimates tended to be 30% or higher than from other states. That put a great deal of attention on New Jersey, and we did everything possible to understand the reasons for our higher prevalence. And I would say, I'm at least very certain that our higher rates are just better case finding, more complete estimates. Mm-hmm. But now in the most recently published ATOM report, we have for the first time active surveillance from California, from San Diego. And
I saw 4%, right?
Yeah, for the first time out, they were novices at doing population-based surveillance. They found a rate of 4% among 8-year-olds, but then very surprisingly, a rate a little bit above 4% for 4-year-olds, which represents the fact that we're still increasing, that rates among the youngest children are still increasing. Mm-hmm. So when you identify that there are multiple US metropolitan areas with autism prevalence in the range of 4%, 5% or higher, this must, and the methodology and the findings and the procedures encourage satisfaction of skepticism to some extent. You weigh all of that, and it's not so hard to say that the preponderance of the evidence leads one to understand that autism affects this many children, that the rate of increase was very significant, that really the conditions and non-etiologic factors, the things related to case finding, are not sufficient to explain a magnitude of change that's so great.
I mean, I think what you just said hits the nail on the head. It seems overwhelmingly obvious to me that that is the case. I mean, beyond preponderance, clear and convincing evidence, right? Of a dramatic increase in autism across many states, but particularly based on these very well done, robust studies, for example, in New Jersey, like you have done, you know, the DDS data in California, where we're comparing apples to apples. I mean, but despite this evidence, and besides everything we've seen with our own eyes, you know, I grew up here in California. No one had autism. I'm sorry, like no one talked about it. It was not a phenomenon. It was not a thing. Mm-hmm. I didn't really know much about it until my son was born in 1999. He was diagnosed in 2001. So in 2001, I was kind of like, oh, what is this autism thing? But where was it? And in fact, you know, there is no evidence for this, what they call hidden horde, right, of adults with autism. In California, in our DDS system, we would have captured them as something. They would have been in our system as something. And there is no evidence that they are there or that they're somewhere, you know, hiding, you know, in an attic, you know, here in California.
We don't have institutions for long-term hospitalization or care for ongoing services. That's not part of our social medicine model. We don't have big institutions which are warehousing people. That is great. But if you accept the idea that autism prevalence has always been 3% or 4%, then you have to conjecture that somehow these individuals are concealed or overlooked or...
Yeah, exactly. Where are they? I mean, there's no data.
Or you have to conclude, which I think many people do, that the definition of autism has become so plastic and so enlarged as to encompass people who don't have disabilities or disorders, that it encompasses people who have high levels of success in some occupations or professions.
Elon Musk.
Yes, one can be a world caliber billionaire with autism. One could be a world caliber actor with autism. One could be a world caliber innovator in technology and have autism. One can, I did meet such a person in the last 7 or 8 months, a member of Harvard class of 2024, who is otherwise in every possible way very successful and accomplished, asserting that she has autism spectrum disorder. So if you don't accept that we've made the definition meaningless, and you can't find all those individuals with concealed autism among our adults and adolescents, then you have to at least take seriously the possibility that what we saw was a true and significant increase in autism prevalence. And if you accept that, you must be provoked, I would say, to try to understand the reasons for it.
Yeah.
And the reasons for it might be multiple. Most of them, I suspect, we haven't really been successful at identifying, but those real reasons are still out there, and they're increasing greater effects from year to year.
Right. Well, I certainly believe there are areas that have been vastly understudied, under-researched in terms of autism causation. It's not the purpose of this podcast today, but one thing I do want to comment on is the vaccine theory. I think one of the reasons that the scientific field kind of backpedaled, against talking about the autism increase is because they didn't want to fuel the vaccine hypothesis. They didn't want people to become more vaccine skeptical. I want to say there is no evidence that vaccination is associated with autism risk. There is none. Vaccines are not responsible for this increase in autism. That is abundantly clear, not only based on the epidemiology, but when you look at the biological mechanisms, there's no plausible biological mechanism that links vaccination and the development of this neurodevelopmental disorder. And if anything, vaccines protect. We know that early childhood infections can lead to brain damage and autistic-like traits. They protect. So, but I think that people just didn't want to in any way create any semblance of an idea, right, that vaccines could be connected to autism. So there was that. Also, we couldn't find any causes for it. So how could it be increasing if there are no causes? The environmental causes that were investigated came up empty.
The Centers for Disease Control established a whole multi-state network for investigating autism risk factors. That system has been at work for at least 10 to 15 years. And so far as I can tell, no primary reasons for increasing autism have been disclosed.
No.
The network, which was supposed to find something like that, didn't find anything, and therefore they shifted their activities to be more about the expression of autism or co-occurring conditions or some aspects of the different diagnostic processes from state to state leading to better identification or not. So it's very puzzling that so many high quality, well-informed people have been working on something like the basic question of prevalence and risk factors intensively for 20 years, maybe longer if you count what the CDC has been involved with on its own. And yet we're no clearer about what is the true rate of autism. Is the rate increasing? What are the risk factors for autism? And I would also say we've seen no shift in spite of better awareness. Overall, we've seen no real improvement in the age at which children come to attention and no change in the age at which children get an autism diagnosis. So if everything was driven by autism awareness, I would expect that those other indicators would be consistent with that. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's embarrassing. I have to admit, I'm somewhat embarrassed that I've gone to the public 8 or 9 times reporting on autism prevalence. And while I take pride in the fact that our group has generated very accurate estimates, true estimates, that we in fact don't understand what's driving the increase in autism. Mm-hmm. Unless we get to that point, I think all the forces for denial and obfuscation will keep repeating what's been a pretty successful narrative, which is it's better awareness, better case finding, better diagnoses, maybe better services.
Yeah,
But all
it's a
those
very
things
successful narrative. It's the conventional wisdom now that there's no true increase in autism. I mean, despite these mountains of data, and despite what we see with our own eyes,
yeah.
it's astonishing to me that there isn't, not just concern, but outright panic over this. We're talking about a very significant percentage of our children with lifelong serious neurodevelopmental disability. And we're treating it like it's like just a difference that we just didn't notice before.
Yeah, somehow the message has become every time autism prevalence higher, but no reason for concern.
Right.
It could
Every
be
year.
better awareness. It could be that we're finding minority children who were not identified before. Maybe it could be a shift in the diagnostic system. Many are, it could be diagnostic shifting. Children who used to be called intellectually disabled or have some other or ADHD plus language impairment or language disorder. Now everybody can call them autistic.
Can we talk about this? Because that's
Yeah.
one thing that people say all the time. Well, these are people who used to be called, the R word, or they used to be classified as intellectually disabled, and now they're just it's preferable to call them autistic instead. We hear that a lot. Now, I
Right.
don't, the California data definitely doesn't show that to be the case.
Right.
I mean, can you speak to
California
that?
data seems to have maintained the same definition over time. Well, kind
And
of.
we also don't see the shift. We don't see like this big group that was ID has now, shifted to AD. The data doesn't show that.
Right. In addition to that, data from California not showing the substitution or diagnostic substitution, there's a very good study published by a group, mainly from the CDC, but not under the auspices of the CDC, where Kim Van Arden Braun was the primary investigator. It came out, I would think, at least 6 or 7 years ago, and she used data from the CDC Atlanta investigation. And CDC had been investigating not only autism, it's called MATSPA, Metropolitan Atlanta Developmental Disabilities Program. Even before the ATOM network started, they had been monitoring intellectual disability, visual impairment, hearing impairment, cerebral palsy, and a couple of other things. And in this paper by Kim Van Arden Braun, she monitors or tracks, keeping standard definitions and using active case finding. She tracks the trend of intellectual disability and the trend of autism spectrum disorder. And they're not in the predicted way if you believe the substitution idea. Autism increased without a significant decrease in ID. In fact, the increase in autism spectrum disorder is probably in part, in a subtle way, involved in a subtle, slight increase in the number of children with intellectual disability. It's not substitution. It's that autism spectrum has increased autonomously from other childhood disorders. Oops, I wonder if we're falling away. I see you, Josephine. Something happened to Jill Escher, though. Gee, at least I've been talking a long time. You have to get your 3 points out. I think you're pretty close to getting the plateau point.
Also, I actually have to go.
Well, then Jill's projection about how long this might last is kind of, in the ballpark. She said it could go 20 minutes or an hour.
I'm sorry that my computer just glitched out. It says it's still recording. Okay, so we were talking about the diagnostic shift in Atlanta. If you could just pick up there, and yeah, I'm very sorry about it. We just had a little technical glitch. Back to you, Dr. Zaharadny, about diagnostic substitution.
If people are concerned with the idea or the possibility that autism prevalence is increased because we're substituting diagnostically and calling children with profiles autistic who would have been called something else different, in addition to looking at the California DDS data, I would encourage them to look at a paper by Kim Van Arden Braun and other investigators published 6 or 7 years ago in PLOS1, which tracked the prevalence trends of intellectual disability, cerebral palsy, and autism in a very consistent, strategic way using the CDC's own data, and they don't find evidence for diagnostic substitution. On the contrary, I'm pretty sure that Kim, consistent with what you reported about California, found average annual increase in autism prevalence of about 11%. So totally different methodologies with totally different data sets really disprove the idea of symptom or autism diagnostic substitution and show consistent increase approximately 10% a year. These are real data. Nobody will contradict them because nobody else, aside from the CDC and a small number, and the DDS, and a small number of individual investigators are looking at autism epidemiology in large populations. Findings from Scandinavian registries are great, but they have their own issues and problems, and they are not automatically representative of autism in the United States. They're very different populations, and as you would guess, you're only going to be in a registry if you're diagnosed with autism. And so, to me, saying that you know with confidence what the number of diagnosed individuals or the prevalence of autism is based on that is still saying that you're underestimating by 20% the true prevalence of autism.
So what do you think the future holds for research in this area? I mean, I feel like right now we're in this kind of global state of denial of a very, very urgent public health crisis. Perhaps that won't change until we have some sense of the biological factors that are leading to this increase. And I'm with you. It's going to be factors. It's not going to be like there's one thing. For example, I talked to an autism researcher the other week, and he said, well, a lot of it is probably having to do with, some sort of adverse, the kind of neonatal, perinatal event. Mm-hmm. So for example, more and more premature infants are surviving, more and more infants that, would have died, because they had like a heart defect are now surviving because of advanced surgical techniques. Children born with hypoxia, et cetera. He thinks that's some of it. And that he's probably right. I think there is actually some data to suggest that's a little bit, right, of the increase.
Yes, definitely. Low birth weight prematurity definitely associated with greater risk.
Yeah.
Can't explain.
We can't explain, right.
Increase. The number of premature babies that are surviving like 23, 24 week old newborns is not increasing that dramatically. We kind of increased through the 90s and into 2000, but now that's plateaued also. There's a kind of a point of viability which we're not able to cross at this point. But so autism risk, there are some neonatal or perinatal factors. There may be some, I would expect there to be other environmental triggers or risk factors, but
I mean, I definitely work on, a hypothesis, again, that remains underexplored, having to do with the exposures to the parents, not to the child. The work I do is, involves with toxicants that the parents are exposed to that can change the way that their germ cells work, that is their egg and sperm. So it's a complicated story, but it's one of those things. It's sort of like, well, we have to turn over all the rocks. Well, we haven't even looked at this rock yet, right? This is a big one, a big boulder that remains to be explored. So I'm hoping that will result in a better understanding of at least of some portion,
Right. I
of
think
the autism
also a
increase.
part of the confusion about autism prevalence, I think, is due to the fact that genetic hypotheses tend to attract a lot of interest and automatic acceptance. And a lot
Funding.
of money has gone into identifying, with small effect, I would say, the true biological genetic factors relevant for autism. But it is true. And yet, if autism is biological or genetic, how can it be increasing? That's not consistent with our, I would call it our paradigm of development.
Well, I think, I wrote a paper about this recently with scientists. I'm not a scientist, but I wrote with 5 other scientists in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. And one thing we talk about is, well, autism is highly heritable. We know that it is highly heritable, but there's very little evidence that it's highly genetic. You have to separate those two things. Like, what can be causing the heritability of autism that is not found in the DNA sequence? And our whole paper was about that, that there is this thing called non-genetic inheritance that can increase the risk for neurodevelopmental disorders. But that's not the way they're trained in school. That's not the way they think about causes of heritable effects. So we're a little bit in the dark ages, unfortunately, when it comes to that. But let's switch gears a little bit. Let's go to the future. We're in this bad place right now. Let's admit it. We're in a place of incredible denialism about a very, very, very serious crisis in terms of the mental health of our children. What can we do to, we obviously have a ton of data, but what can we do to highlight, how important this is, how real this is, and kind of get more attention to this reality? What do you think?
Yeah, so somehow there has to be a shift in the explanatory structure for autism. So far, we're missing an understanding of the driving elements of prevalence. When we discover that, everything else, I suspect, that we've learned so far will begin to make a lot of sense and can be used to advance better identification and better treatment. But for the foreseeable future, I have taken a kind of an approach which shifts away from the question of how do you prove whether the increase is a true increase in prevalence and related questions. Our group is convinced that there is a true increase in prevalence, and we see very strong wealth and race-based disparities in the identification of autism. And so by that, we reason that the most productive, effective, clinically useful for families thing we could do is to try to establish the basis for universal autism screening. Pediatricians are not identifying autism in their standard developmental monitoring activities. They need to have an effective autism screener that identifies kids between 18 and 36 months. People have tried, again, this is a story that goes back to 2000. I'm pretty sure that the original checklist for autism in toddlers was published in 2000. Dr. Baron Cohen came up with the idea that if you have a screener, you could make tremendous headway in early identification. He was absolutely right about that. But unfortunately, the chat, then the MChat, then the MChat RF are not efficient or sensitive enough to be good quality autism screeners. So our group decided, well, we'll build the better autism screener, and that's how we'll be able to at least make a difference with regard to the children who are most underserved and with the greatest potential for maybe some positive effect.
Is that something that's available now?
Yes, definitely. I know I'm touting my own horn, but the PDQ one, which was published an excellent paper which prospectively screened over 1,000 children in our region from very varied economic and race backgrounds. We found that the PDQ-1, which is a 10-item parent report questionnaire, is good, sensitive at identifying cases, very good at avoiding non-cases, that is false positives, and has a positive predictive value of about 85%. I don't think we're ever going to get above 85% predictive value with a questionnaire or a non-biological assay. When we have a biological test, we'll maybe get to 99.6%. But so far, I don't see where's that going to come from? And so I would rather try to get a lot more children with an early detection of a problem. They don't have to be diagnosed early. They just have to have a professional evaluation, which then leads to services. And so universal autism screening is the way to go. Otherwise, we'll keep duplicating what we've learned a lot, which is people from wealthy backgrounds get identified early. They get the advantage of early intervention program services. They get a smoother transition to the education preschool disabled programs. They get diagnosed earlier. I didn't expect to find strong SES differences because I thought we were kind of beyond that in a well-supported
SES means
socioeconomic status. Not just, I didn't expect wealth to matter so much, but people with resources, people from wealthier communities also have maybe better information and better access. And that leads to better and earlier interventions. That's something I'm pretty sure we could make a difference with. At some point, the missing pieces from the autism prevalence trend story will fall into place, and we'll have the benefit of telling people we saw this happening and we're hoping to get some action based on what we saw. But in the meantime, we did something that's, I hope and confident, which will pick up kids from underserved backgrounds between 18 and 30 months, and that could make a difference in their outcomes.
Although the latest CDC report did show a sort of leveling among the different ethnic groups. So as progress seems to be made already in that area.
Yeah, that's it. Yes, in general, overall, we are across the Atom network states making we are making progress in identifying minority children and low-income children. But even under the best circumstance, we're still lagging in that regard. And it would seem like easy to do. That is, recommend universal screening. It doesn't cost money. It doesn't take time. It's based on the information of the mother, who's the expert on a young child's development. It works across different groups and categories of awareness and wealth. What could be the downside? And after 20 years of trying to succeed in the argument that autism prevalence is a significant public health phenomenon and problem, I'm not giving up on that question, but I decided to try to do something that could be practical before we get to convince the ivory tower people or the skeptics or the neurodiversity people that the scope of autism is something very important to accept, address, and to try to do something about.
Right. yeah, if we could just put in like even a small fraction of what we've put into COVID testing for children, right, to autism testing, just a little bit. Autism, frankly, presents a much graver risk to children now than COVID does. But
I
yeah,
understand the dramatic nature of infectious diseases and morbidity and mortality because of pathogens and virus. That's all very important, makes the epidemiologists kind of understand that they're useful. But what could be more useful than trying to address something that affects, okay, 5% of the pediatric population, which is 8% of boys? How can that not be
how could it not be?
compelling?
I would think it would be the single greatest priority for the NIH and the CDC, frankly, because it is that big and it is that devastating. Everybody who's predicted what the cost of this will be, not just private costs, but the society's cost, it's just massive. And you would think this would be the top priority, but instead it's you kind of get this big shoulder shrug.
It's still a political phenomenon for some people.
Yeah,
people in different vested agencies and organizations have like an interest in, I think, understating the importance of autism prevalence because they don't understand what's driving it.
Yeah.
And if you've been studying something for 25 or 30 years and you don't understand it, are you an expert on it? I don't really blame myself because I'm an itinerant clinical psychologist who re-educated as an epidemiologist. But what about the gigantic federally funded institutes and agencies which spend millions? And to what effect? We're still talking about the controversy in autism epidemiology, 1994, 2001, 2019. Isn't that like long enough?
Long enough. Yeah, you would think. So, well, we've gone on quite some time, and I really want to thank you.
My gratitude.
Josephine, do you have anything else that you would like to add about the epidemiology work you do in New Jersey, or anything else related to autism?
So I just really want to say that all indications that we're seeing now also is that autism is likely to keep increasing. What we're also seeing on county level data when we look at aggregate data, we're seeing, yes, there's this leveling off where we're seeing Hispanic children, Black children are identified as their white peers. But when we look at the county level data, we're seeing a lot of disparities. And that indicates that over time, when we improve identification, autism is also likely to increase even more. So even though our estimates are very high now, we're probably undercounting.
Yeah. And it's very frightening when you think about, the adult service sector, which will have to absorb, the shock of this incredible increase in children, in 5, 10, 20 years from now. And that sector is now, as we know, completely overwhelmed already by autism. And we're just seeing a fraction of what's coming in this tidal wave. It really is terrifying to me, that we aren't taking this data more seriously, and we aren't.
I'm not an epidemiologist, but one of the main reasons for doing surveillance and prevalence investigations is to know the true scope of the problem or disorder or issue that you're addressing. How can you make effective treatment planning or service planning or planning of training of the next professionals who are going to care for individuals with autism? How can you do that if you don't acknowledge that there's a problem? And if you don't, and not acknowledging the problem sometimes is understating the problem. If I accept that the ADAM composite estimate of autism prevalence is approximately 2%, I think that I'm not aware in the way that is likely to lead to correct planning. If the true prevalence is double 2%, how can we be laying the ground for the teachers that will need to learn about autism when they go into the classroom, the doctors who learn about autism that go into practice, the specialists and different training experts? How can we ever get to the right amount of care and personnel if we're still stuck on
yeah, and for us,
so it's just stuck on information that's like 10 years old. When we looked at the 1998 birth cohort in 2006, that's almost like your older child, we found a prevalence of 1.7%. That was a long time ago, and 1.7 to 2% is what the CDC composite estimate is saying in 2021.
Right. And yeah, but I would say, yes, the reality is that it's higher now. But even if it's 2%, it's not like our long-term care system is anywhere close to any acknowledgement of a 2% of the population having these serious neurodevelopmental impairments, that will require some level of lifespan care. We're not even close to it.
Of course, I think, I don't know about California, but in New Jersey, the DD, Developmental Disabilities Division, which provides for support and care of adults, is operating under the expectation of 30 years ago, which is that the rate of need is about 1.5%. Okay, if you're gauging the rate of need to be based only on individuals with intellectual disability, then you're kind of close. But then you're not factoring all those individuals who have autism without intellectual disability.
Same here in California. Yeah. So yeah, the work ahead for us is beyond comprehension. But I really want to thank you guys for going over, what I think is this issue of absolutely fundamental importance. We can't talk about policy. We can't talk about the future until there is some acceptance of this as a true growth in serious impairment. And it's really, it's been disconcerting for me to witness the level of denialism in our community. So it's refreshing to actually talk about facts with people who actually do the work and are out there collecting the data. So thank you so much. And I hope we get to meet again, maybe after the next study is out, get to update the data.
Thank you so much for your attention, Jill. It's really an important topic, and I'm grateful for your bringing it to the attention of a lot of people.
Well, thank you, Dr. Zaharadny. Thank you both.
Stay well.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.